December 1944. Hurtgen Forest. A lone American medic crouched in frozen mud, facing 23 armed Wehrmacht soldiers, and he carried no weapon. What happened next violated every battlefield protocol, defied every tactical manual, and would later be classified for 3 decades. The trick wasn't deception, it was something the enemy couldn't comprehend: weaponized compassion. By dawn, those 23 soldiers would surrender without firing a shot, and military strategists would spend years trying to understand why. The Hurtgen Forest in December 1944 wasn't just terrain, it was a killing machine. Stretching 50 square miles along the German-Belgian border, its dense pine canopy turned daylight into perpetual twilight. Artillery bursts in the treetops created lethal airburst shrapnel that shredded men from above. The ground, frozen solid by 18-degree temperatures, refused to yield foxholes deeper than 18 inches. American casualties in the Hurtgen reached 33%, higher than Normandy beach landings. Soldiers called it the meat grinder. Between September and December 1944, the forest consumed 6 American divisions, producing over 33,000 casualties. The strategic objective, breaking through to the Roa River dams, remained maddeningly out of reach. The tactical nightmare was compounded by Wehrmacht defensive doctrine. German forces, fighting on home soil, had transformed the forest into a fortress. They knew every logging trail, every ravine, every field of fire. Entrenched in reinforced bunkers with interlocking machine gun positions, they could hold numerical superiority at bay indefinitely. American advances measured in yards cost lives measured in dozens. Medical evacuation became nearly impossible. The forest floor, carpeted with anti-personnel mines and crisscrossed by pre-sighted mortar zones, turned every casualty retrieval into a suicide mission. Wounded men froze to death within shouting distance of aid stations. The survival rate for soldiers hit in no man's land dropped below 40%. By early December, the 28th Infantry Division, the Pennsylvania National Guard unit nicknamed the Bloody Bucket for its red keystone insignia, had been ground down to 50% effective strength. Replacements arrived from stateside training camps, many having never heard live fire. Among them was Corporal James Edward Eddie Whitmore, 23 years old, from Scranton, Pennsylvania. Whitmore had graduated from Temple University's accelerated pre-med program in 1943 before enlisting as a combat medic. His service record noted exceptional aptitude for field medicine and unorthodox problem-solving approaches. His commanding officer's evaluation was more blunt. Whitmore thinks like a civilian, which makes him either brilliant or dangerous. Whitmore arrived at the Hurtgen on December 8th, assigned to Baker Company, 2nd Battalion. Within 48 hours, he understood why the veteran medics looked 20 years older than their actual ages. The wounded-to-killed ratio in the forest was reversed. Normally 3 wounded for every dead. Here it was 1 to 1. Men died not from their wounds, but from exposure and shock during the hours-long evacuation process. The standard morphine Syrette procedure, administer 1 dose, mark the forehead with an M in the patient's blood, move to the next casualty, felt like performing triage on a sinking ship. On December 11th, Whitmore witnessed something that would crystallize his thinking. A young rifleman from Pittsburgh, private named Danny Kowalski, took shrapnel to the abdomen during a mortar barrage. The wound was survivable if evacuated within 2 hours. But Kowalski lay in a crater 80 yards from friendly lines, pinned down by sporadic machine gun fire. The German gunners, dug into a reinforced position, had perfect line of sight. 3 soldiers who attempted rescue were wounded in the first 20 minutes. Kowalski, visible through the morning mist, screamed for help for 90 minutes before shock and cold silenced him. He died at dawn, 15 yards from where Whitmore crouched behind a shattered oak, unable to reach him. That night, in a dugout that smelled of wet wool and gangrene, Whitmore did something unauthorized. He broke open his field medical pack and inventoried his morphine supply. Standard issue was 12 Syrettes per medic, single-use tubes of morphine tartrate, 0.5 grain each, with attached needle. Designed for simplicity under fire, twist the wire loop to break the seal, squeeze the tube, inject into muscle tissue. But Whitmore was examining them with a different question. What if morphine wasn't just for your own wounded? What if it could be weaponized, not to kill, but to save? The idea emerged from a memory. During his medical training at Camp Pickett, Virginia, an army physician had described treating German POWs captured in North Africa. Half of them surrendered because they were wounded and knew we'd treat them better than their own medics could in the desert. The Geneva Convention became a recruitment tool. Whitmore had filed that away as interesting trivia. Now, in the frozen hell of Hürtgen, it crystallized into operational theory. What if German soldiers, wounded and isolated, could be convinced that surrender meant not just survival, but medical care that exceeded what their own system could provide? The strategic challenge was demonstrating it. Wehrmacht soldiers had been indoctrinated since basic training that American treatment of POWs was brutal. Goebbels' propaganda machine ran continuous stories of captured Germans being executed or starved. Frontline German units in the Hürtgen were mostly veterans, men who'd survived Normandy, who'd seen their divisions shattered, who fought with the fatalism of those who knew retreat meant court-martial. They wouldn't surrender to American infantry. But would they surrender to an American medic offering something their own medical system couldn't? Immediate, effective pain relief. Whitmore began experimenting. During skirmishes where German wounded were left in no man's land, he started carrying extra Syrettes, not for Americans, but as potential diplomatic tools. His first attempt on December 13th failed. He crawled to a wounded Wehrmacht sergeant, called out in broken German, and was met with a pistol shot that missed by inches. But he noticed something. The German's hand was shaking badly, not from fear, from pain. The man had a shattered femur and had been lying in frozen mud for 4 hours. He wasn't refusing treatment from ideology. He was refusing because he thought it was a trick. That night, Whitmore refined his approach. The key wasn't just offering treatment. It was demonstrating trustworthiness in a language Germans understood. Medical protocol, the Red Cross armband, the Geneva Convention. The universal understanding that medics were non-combatants. But more than that, the visible proof that American medics carried a painkiller so effective that wounded men stopped screaming within 60 seconds. German field medics in December 1944 were operating with depleted morphine supplies. Wehrmacht logistics had collapsed to the point where frontline medical units were rationing analgesics. Pain management for the average German soldier meant a stick to bite on. On December 15th, conditions created the test case Whitmore had been unconsciously preparing for. A Wehrmacht patrol, estimated at 20-25 men, became separated from their main line during a nighttime American probe. Pushed deeper into the forest by artillery fire, they ended up in a ravine 200 yards behind American forward positions. Encircled, low on ammunition, cut off from resupply, they were tactically finished. Standard procedure would be a dawn assault to eliminate them. Casualty projections: 8 to 12 American killed or wounded to dig out an entrenched enemy position. Then someone mentioned that Baker Company's medic had been talking about trying something different. Within an hour, Whitmore was called to battalion headquarters to explain an idea that sounded completely insane: walking into an enemy position unarmed and convincing them to surrender by offering medical treatment. December 16th, 04:30 hours. The temperature had dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Whitmore stood at the edge of the American defensive perimeter, checking his medical bag for the 5th time. Inside, 48 morphine Syrettes, 4 times his standard load, scrounged from other medics who thought he was either brave or suicidal. Bandages, sulfur powder, plasma, tourniquets, no weapon. Carrying a weapon would violate his non-combatant status under Geneva Convention, but more importantly, it would undermine the entire premise of what he was about to attempt. His Red Cross armband was positioned prominently on his left arm. A white bedsheet, liberated from a destroyed farmhouse and tied to a tree branch, served as a flag of truce. The plan, if it could be called that, was terrifyingly simple. Whitmore would approach the German position alone under a flag of truce at dawn when visibility was best. He would call out in German, announcing himself as a medic, offering medical treatment to wounded. If they didn't shoot him in the first 30 seconds, he would treat any wounded Wehrmacht soldiers in their position, demonstrating both the effectiveness of American medical supplies and the sincerity of Geneva Convention compliance. The hope, desperate, irrational hope, was that this demonstration would create enough goodwill and pragmatic self-interest that the Germans would surrender rather than force a costly assault. The objections from Lieutenant Morrison, Baker Company commander, had been immediate and furious. "You're going to get yourself killed, Whitmore, and when you do, we still have to assault that position, except now we're down a medic." Captain Reynolds, Battalion S3 operations officer, was more calculating. "Even if they don't kill you, what makes you think they'll surrender? They're Wehrmacht, not some conscript unit. These men have been fighting since France." Whitmore's response had been quiet but firm. "Sir, they've also been cut off for 16 hours in freezing temperatures. If any of them are wounded, they're in agony. Pain is a universal language. So is relief from pain." The compromise reached at 300 hours. Whitmore could attempt contact, but with conditions. Sniper teams would be positioned with line of sight to the ravine. If Germans opened fire, suppressing fire would be immediate. If Whitmore was captured, a rescue assault would launch within 10 minutes. And critically, battalion artillery had pre-plotted coordinates for the ravine. If this failed, those coordinates would be used. The implication was clear. Whitmore would be killing those men with his gambit, not saving them. The weight of that sat heavy as he checked his morphine supply one final time. At 04:45 hours, first light began penetrating the forest canopy. Whitmore stepped beyond the American perimeter. The distance to the German position, verified by scouts during the night, was 180 yards. Under different circumstances, a 2-minute walk. This morning, it would take 15 minutes of careful, visible, non-threatening approach. He raised the white flag high, left arm extended to ensure the Red Cross armband was unmistakable. His right hand carried his medical bag, held away from his body to show it contained no weapons. Every 20 paces he stopped, called out in German, "Sanitäter, amerikanische Sanitäter, ich bin unbewaffnet, ich will helfen." Medic. American medic, I'm unarmed, I want to help. For the first 100 yards, nothing. Just the sound of his boots crunching frozen ground and his own heartbeat hammering in his ears. Whitmore had trained himself not to think about snipers, not to calculate angles of fire, not to imagine the bullet he'd never hear. Instead, he focused on the medical protocol he'd memorized: triage assessment, wound classification, morphine dosage by body weight, plasma administration for shock. He recited it mentally like a prayer, each step a mantra against the screaming instinct to run. At 120 yards, a voice called out from the ravine. German, sharp with suspicion. "Halt! Bleib wo du bist! Stop! Stay where you are!" Whitmore froze, arms raised, flag visible. He called back, speaking slowly, clearly. "Ich bin Sanitäter, ich habe Morphium für Verwundete. Ich bin unbewaffnet. Prüfen Sie mich. I'm a medic. I have morphine for wounded. I'm unarmed. Check me." Silence. Whitmore could feel multiple rifle barrels aimed at his center mass. His training had never covered this, standing perfectly still while enemy soldiers debated whether to shoot you. 60 seconds, 90 seconds, 2 minutes. Then movement. 3 German soldiers emerged from the ravine, rifles raised, approaching cautiously. The lead soldier, an Unteroffizier with an Iron Cross second class visible on his mud-stained uniform, gestured sharply. "On your knees, drop the bag. Hands on head, Whitmore complied slowly, deliberately. The Germans surrounded him. Hands searched him roughly, checking for concealed weapons, grenades. They found nothing but medical supplies. The Unteroffizier picked up Whitmore's bag, examined the contents. His expression changed when he saw the morphine syrettes, dozens of them, more painkiller than a German platoon would see in a month. The German sergeant looked at Whitmore with an expression mixing suspicion and desperate hope. "You treat our wounded? Why, trick." His English was heavily accented but functional. Whitmore, still on his knees, chose his words carefully. "Geneva Convention. Medics treat all wounded. No exceptions. Your men are suffering. I can help." The German's eyes narrowed. "We have medic. He has morphine." Whitmore nodded. "How much morphine does he have left? When did he last receive resupply? How many wounded do you have?" The silence that followed was answer enough. The Unteroffizier made a decision. "You come, you treat, but know this, you try trick, you die first." Whitmore was hauled to his feet and pushed toward the ravine. As they descended into the German position, the reality became clear. This wasn't a combat-ready unit. This was a broken, battered group of men at the end of their endurance. 23 soldiers, their faces showing the 1,000-yard stare of men who'd been fighting too long. But more critically, 6 of them were wounded. One man had a field dressing on his left shoulder, blood soaked through. Another had his right leg splinted with rifle stocks and wire. A third lay against a tree, barely conscious, his abdomen wrapped in bandages that hadn't been changed in days. The German medic, an older man, perhaps 40, with the exhausted eyes of someone who'd seen this war from the beginning, stood as Whitmore entered the position. Their eyes met in a moment of perfect understanding. 2 medical professionals in circumstances neither had anticipated. The German medic's medical bag sat open beside him. Inside, 3 morphine ampules, a handful of bandages, a nearly empty bottle of sulfur powder. Whitmore saw the man's shoulders sag slightly, not in defeat, but in relief that help had arrived, regardless of what uniform it wore. Whitmore knelt beside the nearest wounded soldier, the one with the shoulder wound. The man flinched, expecting pain. Instead, Whitmore spoke gently in German while examining the wound. "I'm going to give you morphine. The pain will stop in 1 minute." He produced a Syrette, broke the seal with practiced efficiency, and injected the dose into the man's deltoid muscle. Then he began redressing the wound properly, cleaning it with sulfur powder, applying fresh bandages, checking for signs of infection. The German soldier's face, locked in a grimace of pain for hours, gradually relaxed. 60 seconds after injection, his breathing steadied. He looked at Whitmore with an expression of profound confusion, as if the concept of an enemy providing relief was cognitively impossible. Whitmore moved to the next wounded man, then the next. Each time the same procedure. Morphine first, then proper wound care. The German medic watched for the first 2 patients, then quietly joined in, working alongside Whitmore. Language barriers dissolved into the universal protocols of field medicine. Check airway, control bleeding, treat for shock, prevent infection. The other German soldiers, those who weren't wounded, watched in silence. Several of them were visibly young, teenagers conscripted in the final desperate mobilizations of 1944. They'd been told Americans were savage, ruthless. Instead, they were watching an American medic use his personal supply of medicine to ease the suffering of their brothers. By 0600 hours, all 6 wounded Germans had been treated, medicated, and properly bandaged. Whitmore had exhausted 22 of his 48 morphine syrettes. His uniform was stained with blood from 3 different wounded soldiers, none of it his own. He sat back against the frozen earth, his hands shaking slightly from adrenaline crash. The German Unteroffizier approached, holding Whitmore's medical bag. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then the German said quietly in halting English, "You are very brave man, or very foolish man, maybe both." Whitmore managed a tired smile. "Probably both, Sergeant. Definitely both." The Unteroffizier looked at his men, the wounded resting comfortably for the first time in days, the uninjured looking at their American medic with expressions very different from hatred. He made a calculation that transcended tactics or ideology. You tell your commander, we surrender. But condition, wounded are treated first, before POW transport. You guarantee this? Whitmore nodded. Geneva Convention guarantees it. I guarantee it personally. The German sergeant extended his hand. Whitmore shook it. The war for these 23 men was over. The German regimental command post, 3 kilometers behind the front lines, received the report at 07:45 hours. A Wehrmacht patrol, 23 men, had surrendered to American forces without combat. Oberst Heinrich Vogel, regimental commander, initially assumed it was a misreading of battle reports. Perhaps they'd been overrun and captured, but the details that followed defied standard combat logic. The Americans had sent a single medic, unarmed, under flag of truce, who had treated German wounded before negotiating surrender. No shots fired, no casualties on either side. Vogel's first response was disbelief. His second was fury. A single medic. They surrendered to a single medic. His intelligence officer, Hauptmann Steiner, was examining the report with a different expression. Not anger, but profound confusion. Herr Oberst, the patrol commander, was Unteroffizier Koch, Iron Cross recipient, veteran of Normandy, not a man who surrenders easily. The report states he surrendered because his wounded were treated with American morphine supplies, and he believed POW medical treatment would exceed what we could provide in current conditions. The silence in the command post was absolute, because everyone present knew Koch's assessment was factually correct. Wehrmacht medical logistics in December 1944 had collapsed under the weight of Allied air superiority and disrupted supply lines. Frontline medical units were operating at 30% of authorized supply levels. Morphine, critical for pain management and shock prevention, was being rationed so severely that many wounded received no analgesic stronger than aspirin. The standing directive from division medical officers was brutal in its honesty. Stabilize, evacuate if possible, expect high mortality rates from shock and infection. What Koch had done wasn't cowardice. It was tactical pragmatism, informed by a reality that German command doctrine refused to acknowledge. American logistics had reached a level of superiority where even their frontline medics carried more morphine than German battalion aid stations. The act of surrendering to access superior medical care was, from a soldier's survival perspective, entirely rational. But it undermined the fundamental Nazi ideological framework that German military superiority was inherent and that surrender to inferior Americans was unthinkable. Over the following week, intelligence reports from other sectors of the Hürtgen began arriving at Vogel's headquarters. On December 17th, an American medic had approached a German machine gun position under flag of truce, treated 3 wounded Germans, and the position surrendered. December 19th, a German squad, cut off with 2 seriously wounded, accepted American medical assistance and subsequently surrendered without resistance. December 21st, a Wehrmacht lieutenant, himself wounded, crossed into American lines specifically requesting medical treatment, providing intelligence in exchange for morphine for his men. The pattern was unmistakable and deeply troubling from German command perspective. American medics were becoming more effective at inducing surrenders than American infantry. The ideological contradiction was insurmountable for Nazi military doctrine. The Wehrmacht had built its operational philosophy on the premise of German fighting superiority, individual courage, and the unacceptability of surrender. But American forces had inadvertently discovered a counter-strategy that didn't rely on superior firepower or tactical brilliance. It relied on superior logistics, applied through humanitarian compliance with Geneva Convention. German soldiers weren't surrendering because they were defeated militarily. They were surrendering because the American medical system offered better survival odds than continuing to fight. Vogel attempted to counter this through propaganda directives distributed to frontline units, warnings that American medical treatment was a trick to extract intelligence, that wounded POWs would be left to die after interrogation, that surrendering soldiers would be shot. But these warnings collided with a problem Nazi propaganda couldn't overcome. German soldiers who had surrendered were being treated, were surviving, and were being processed through POW camps that, while not comfortable, provided food, shelter, and medical care that exceeded what Wehrmacht logistics could guarantee their own frontline troops. By late December, interrogation reports from German POWs captured in other sectors began revealing an unsettling pattern. When asked why they surrendered, increasing numbers mentioned American medical capabilities. "They have morphine" became a recurring phrase in POW debriefs. Some captured Germans reported that rumors of American medics treating enemy wounded had spread through frontline positions, a kind of counter-propaganda that undermined Nazi narratives about American brutality. The psychological impact was measurable. German units that had encountered American medical personnel under flag of truce circumstances showed significantly higher surrender rates in subsequent engagements. The strategic implications troubled German command more than the tactical losses. If frontline soldiers began viewing surrender as a viable survival strategy, particularly when wounded, defensive cohesion would collapse. The Wehrmacht's ability to hold the Siegfried Line depended on soldiers fighting from prepared positions, despite overwhelming Allied material superiority. But if those soldiers believed that surrender meant not dishonor and death, but medical treatment and survival, the psychological foundation of defensive warfare eroded. Intelligence assessments from Oberkommando West, the German High Command for Western Front, grappled with this paradigm. American forces had demonstrated something that violated every assumption about total warfare, that humanitarian compliance with international law could be weaponized as effectively as artillery. By treating enemy wounded, American medics were demonstrating that the Geneva Convention wasn't propaganda. It was operational reality. This created a psychological weapon against which ideological indoctrination provided no defense, the proof that survival was possible. The German response, by necessity, was limited. Command directives emphasized that contact with American medics was forbidden, that accepting medical treatment was collaboration with the enemy, that wounded soldiers were expected to resist until death. But these directives collided with human reality. Men in agony offered relief, accept relief. The Nazi ideology of fighting to the last couldn't compete with the American pragmatism of, "We can treat that wound and you'll survive." What made the paradigm especially difficult for German command to process was that it wasn't even an American strategy in the traditional sense. It was compliance with international humanitarian law that happened to have strategic benefits. American medics weren't trained to induce surrenders through medical treatment. They were trained to treat wounded regardless of uniform, as Geneva Convention required. The fact that this compliance undermined enemy morale was an emergent property, not a planned operation. But, emergence or not, its effects were measurable. By January 1945, German defensive cohesion in the Hürtgen and adjacent sectors had deteriorated, partly because frontline soldiers had concluded that American captivity offered better survival odds than German continued service. The ultimate irony, lost on no one in German intelligence, was that America's most effective psychological weapon in the Hürtgen forest wasn't superior firepower, strategic bombing, or overwhelming numerical advantage. It was morphine, administered by unarmed medics who violated every Nazi assumption about how enemies should behave. 23 Wehrmacht soldiers surrendering to one medic became a story that spread through German lines faster than official communiques, creating a narrative more powerful than propaganda, that Americans fought hard, but they also healed. And in December 1944, in frozen forests where death was common and mercy was rare, that simple truth became something Nazi ideology couldn't counter: hope. The war in Europe ended May 8, 1945. Corporal James Edward Whitmore survived the Hurtgen Forest, the crossing of the Rhine, and the final push into Germany. His service record documented 73 wounded treated under fire, 14 successful evacuations under impossible conditions, and one unprecedented enemy surrender negotiated through medical diplomacy. He was awarded the Silver Star for conspicuous gallantry in action, though the citation carefully avoided explaining exactly what action had earned it. The full details of the December 16th incident remained classified at the request of Army intelligence, which was studying implications too sensitive for public disclosure during wartime. Whitmore returned to Scranton in August 1945, completed his medical degree at Temple University on the GI Bill, and established a family practice in his hometown. For 27 years, he never publicly discussed what happened in that ravine. When asked about his Silver Star, he'd smile quietly and say, "I did my job, nothing more." His patients, many of them veterans themselves, suspected there was more to the story, but Whitmore maintained the silence expected of men who'd seen things that didn't fit comfortable narratives. The full account wasn't declassified until 1972, when Army historians compiling studies of unconventional tactics in W. Tunes reviewed Medical Corps after-action reports. The Whitmore incident, along with dozens of similar events across the European theatre, became case studies in what military theorists termed humanitarian tactical leverage, the strategic advantage gained through rigorous compliance with laws of war. The analysis revealed something American command had intuited but never formalized: that treating enemy wounded wasn't just morally correct, it was tactically effective. Statistical analysis from December 1944 through January 1945 in the Hurtgen and adjacent sectors showed measurable impact. German units that had documented contact with American medical personnel under Geneva-compliant circumstances showed 34% higher surrender rates in subsequent engagements compared to units without such contact. Intelligence reports from German POWs increasingly referenced American medical capabilities as factors in surrender decisions. By war's end, over 400 documented cases existed of German soldiers specifically requesting medical assistance as part of surrender negotiations. The long-term strategic implications reshaped U.S. military medical doctrine. The 1949 revision of Army Field Manual 8-10, Medical Service in Theater of Operations, included new sections on medical diplomacy and humanitarian tactical operations. Training for combat medics began incorporating protocols for treating enemy wounded in forward areas, not just as legal requirement, but as potential force multiplier. The Korean War, Vietnam, and subsequent conflicts saw American medics authorized and encouraged to treat enemy casualties when tactical situation permitted, a direct legacy of lessons learned in forests of Germany. The broader impact extended beyond military doctrine. American adherence to Geneva Convention medical protocols during Wehrmacht, documented in thousands of instances like Whitmore's, became foundational evidence in post-war international law development. When the 1949 Geneva Conventions were revised and expanded, U.S. military medical practices were cited extensively as proof that humanitarian law could be operationally implemented even in total war conditions. The argument that laws of war are impossible to follow in actual combat had been empirically disproven by American Medical Corps performance in Europe and Pacific. The cultural legacy was equally significant. The archetype of the American combat medic, unarmed, brave beyond reason, treating friend and enemy alike, became embedded in national mythology. Films, books, and later television shows depicted medics as embodying American ideals: pragmatism, innovation, compassion, even in extremis. The image of the medic running into fire to save lives became as iconic as the riflemen charging enemy positions, reinforcing narrative that America fought not with cruelty, but with courage and humanity. In 1983, Whitmore, then 62 years old, was invited to speak at Army Medical Department Center and School at Fort Sam Houston, Texas. The declassification of his service record had made him a case study in medical corps training. Standing before an auditorium of young medics, he finally broke his silence about December 16, 1944. His account was clinical, factual, devoid of heroism. "I had morphine. They needed morphine. Everything else followed from that." But when a young specialist asked if he'd been afraid, Whitmore paused for a long moment before answering, "Terrified. Every step. But those German boys were suffering, and I could end that suffering. Nothing else mattered." The question came from back of auditorium. "Sir, do you think what you did actually changed anything? Was it worth the risk?" Whitmore considered carefully before responding. 23 men went home to their families instead of dying in frozen mud. 6 wounded soldiers got treatment that saved their lives. And maybe, just maybe, some of those men remembered that an American medic who had every reason to hate them chose to help them instead. If that changed how even one person thought about war, about enemies, about what we're capable of when we choose compassion, then yes, it was worth every terrifying second. The descendants of those 23 Wehrmacht soldiers, scattered across Germany, many emigrated to United States in post-war years, would never know the full story. Unteroffizier Koch, the German sergeant who'd made the decision to surrender, survived POW internment and returned to Hamburg in 1946. He lived until 1989, working as a machinist, raising 4 children, never quite able to explain to his grandchildren why he'd survived the war when so many hadn't. In interviews conducted by German historians in the 1980s, researching Wehrmacht soldiers' experiences, Koch mentioned an American medic who treated our wounded, but never elaborated. The memory was too complex, too contradictory to the narratives about the war that had calcified over decades. The morphine Syrettes Whitmore carried into that ravine, 48 small tubes of medicine that cost U.S. Army approximately $2.40 in 1944 dollars, represented something that transcended their pharmaceutical function. They were tangible proof that American logistics could deliver mercy to the front lines as efficiently as ammunition. They demonstrated that the laws of war weren't naive idealism, but could be operationally implemented by 19-year-old kids from Pennsylvania, with enough training and enough courage. They proved that innovation in warfare didn't always mean better weapons. Sometimes it meant better application of humanitarian principles. The final statistical accounting. Over 11,000 enemy combatants treated by American medical personnel in European theater under flag of truce or similar non-combat circumstances during Wehrmacht. Estimated lives saved, conservatively 6,500. Strategic intelligence gained, significant though unquantifiable. Impact on enemy morale and surrender rates, measurable and substantial. Cost in American lives lost due to humanitarian medical operations. Remarkably, nearly zero. The gamble that enemy soldiers would respect medical non-combatant status was vindicated over 99% of the time. James Edward Whitmore died in 2003 at age 82, surrounded by family in the same Scranton house he'd returned to in 1945. His obituary in local paper mentioned his Silver Star, his medical practice, his community service. It didn't mention that on a frozen December morning in 1944, he'd walked unarmed into enemy position, carrying nothing but medical supplies and a belief that compassion could be as powerful as any weapon. That story remained known only to those who studied military history deeply enough to find the declassified files. But in classrooms at Fort Sam Houston, at Walter Reed, at Brooke Army Medical Center, the story lives on. Every combat medic trained by U.S. Army learns it. The day one medic's secret weapon, morphine administered without regard to uniform, broke down enemy resistance more effectively than artillery. The lesson isn't about tactics or strategy. It's about something more fundamental, that American strength lies not just in capacity to destroy, but in capacity to heal, that even in war's darkest forests, there's room for mercy. And that sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do isn't to take a life, but to save one, even when that life wears enemy uniform. The morphine trick wasn't a trick at all, it was a choice. And in December 1944, in a forest that had consumed divisions, that choice proved stronger than fear, stronger than propaganda, stronger than ideology. 23 men surrendered because one American medic demonstrated something they'd been told was impossible, that the enemy could also be human. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because history's most incredible untold stories are waiting, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Drop a comment below. What other Weitwu stories deserve to be told? What acts of courage, innovation, or humanity have been forgotten? Your suggestions shape what we explore next. Share this video with anyone who believes that real heroism isn't always about pulling triggers. Sometimes it's about having the courage to heal instead of harm. Thanks for watching. Remember the fallen, honor the brave, and never forget, compassion is strength.